There are questions that seem simple, but when placed before the right person at the right moment, they become reminders of an entire life. In 2023, when Richard Gere was already past 70, a reporter asked him, "Do you regret saying the things Hollywood didn't want to hear?" That wasn't a question about an event. It was a question about the essence of who he is. And Richard Gere, after decades of passing through glory, controversy, misunderstanding, and silence, answered with just one brief sentence. "The truth has never been easy, but I wasn't born to stay silent." That response was not meant to justify anything. It felt more like a gentle confession from a man who has paid enough of a price to understand that silence can sometimes be louder than any accusation. For half his life, Gere did not live to chase the spotlight, nor create scandals to stay relevant, nor fight to prove he still had market value. He only tried to hold on to one thing, the cleanliness of his inner self. And it was precisely that which forced him to face things many other stars never had to endure. Toxic rumors, smear campaigns, Hollywood's quiet withdrawal, heartbreaks in love, and years when his talent was diminished simply because he refused to step into the mold the industry expected. Soft light rests on his face, where the wrinkles are no longer marks of time, but a map of a life filled with struggle. In those eyes, one does not see the pride of a seasoned star, but the stillness of a long journey back to one's true self. A journey that perhaps began long ago, in the poor years of Pennsylvania, with the quiet boy who loved the trumpet and books on philosophy, with the young man who dropped out of school to chase a vague dream called the spotlight. And when Richard Gere steps back behind the stage, walking slowly like a soft shadow, his story, the story that has never been told in full, begins to open. Not the story of a Hollywood star, but the story of a man who spent his entire life searching for something people often lose beneath the lights: the truth of who he is. Richard Tiffany Gere was born on August 31st, 1949 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The middle name Tiffany came from his mother's side, given as a reminder of family tradition. A tradition not wealthy, not prestigious, but one that always honored kindness and steadfastness. His father, Homer George Gere, born 1922, was an insurance agent, a man who lived his whole life with calmness and responsibility. His mother, Doris Ann Tiffany Gere, born 1924, was a gentle yet strong woman who believed that compassion was the foundation of all decent human behavior. They were the kind of parents who didn't say much, but whose eyes always conveyed one thing. They wanted their children to grow up knowing how to live rightly. The Gere family moved to North Syracuse when Richard was young. A modest home, 5 siblings, meals that were not fancy but full of laughter. That was the first world Richard knew. In that world, little Richard was not the loudest child, nor the most remarkable in the household. He was the type who watched in silence. From early on, he was different from other kids his age. Instead of running around outside, Richard would sit for hours with the trumpet his father had worked so hard to buy him. His father later recalled that the boy could sit in a corner, holding the instrument in his arms, his eyes gazing into the distance, as if he were listening to a piece of music no one else could hear. That quietness wasn't shyness. It was the sign of an inward-facing soul. He observed every gesture, every glance, every small worry of his parents. He sensed his father's exhaustion after long workdays, and he sensed his mother's patience as she tried to keep the household steady. That Catholic family wasn't wealthy, but they were disciplined. Everything had a schedule, a rule, a belief. But inside Richard, those rules sometimes felt like a slightly cramped room, confining the questions he didn't yet know how to put into words. As he grew older, he began to read more. Western philosophy, Eastern spiritual texts, teachings on meditation that he later said he didn't fully understand at the time. But they opened another door. A door leading to the feeling that life wasn't just what happened before his eyes, but something deeper, quieter, waiting for him to discover. At North Syracuse Central High School, Richard became a student with a calm exterior who always stirred curiosity. He played sports, ran track, and was particularly outstanding in music thanks to his ability with the trumpet. That talent eventually earned him a music scholarship to the University of Massachusetts. But back then, music was not an ambition for Richard. It was a way to ease the anxiety of never being good enough, a fear he would carry throughout his life. A teacher once described him, "That boy lives in two worlds, one of ordinary life and one only he can see." That description was not only true for his childhood, but for Richard Gere's entire life, a life always carrying a deep, hidden part that others could never quite reach. In the late 1960s, as the anti-war movement swept across America, as the younger generation began questioning everything from power to belief, Richard Gere did not join the noise. But quietly, those societal shifts touched him. They stirred in him a longing for freedom, the same freedom that the little boy once felt as another world waiting for him. And in 1967, after finishing high school, Richard Gere left Syracuse for college. No one imagined that just a few years later, the quiet young man would abandon his scholarship, abandon the path that had been laid out for him, to step into the world of theater, a world that would lead him to Hollywood, to glory, to scandal, to rejection, and ultimately to the truth of who he was. But all of that could only begin with a childhood like this, peaceful, quiet, full of rules, yet full of spaces wide enough for the seeds of an artist's soul to take root, a soul that would spend a lifetime seeking truth in silence. When Richard Gere left Syracuse to enter the University of Massachusetts in 1968 with a music scholarship many could only dream of, no one imagined that just 2 years later, he would turn onto a completely different path. People often say the biggest decisions in life appear in the smallest moments. And for Gere, that moment came when he sat in a music class, staring at the blank sheet of paper in front of him and feeling an emptiness inside. Not because he didn't love music, but because he couldn't see his future living within neatly framed musical staffs. He dropped out. Not out of impulsiveness, but out of honesty. Honesty with the growing emptiness within him. Gere went to New York, carrying only a few clothes, some savings, and the trumpet he had cherished since childhood. The very instrument he would later have to sell during a period of hardship. A decision he admitted felt like selling a piece of memory that once made me believe music could save a person. New York in the late 60s was not a gentle city for newcomers, but it was in this place that Gere learned his first lesson about an artist's existence. No one owes you attention, and no one cares whether you are in pain. In those early years, he did everything to survive. Waited tables, delivered goods, cleaned rooms, and sometimes slept on friends' couches because rent was too expensive. Yet strangely, Gere never called it suffering. He spoke of those years as a period when freedom outweighed fear. He tried his hand at off-Broadway. Small rooms, warm lights, the smell of old wood, places where young actors hoped to be noticed. Gere wasn't the most talented in the rehearsal room, but he had a presence that made it hard for people to look away. A soft, quiet masculinity, slightly mysterious, as if he always carried within him an untold story. Directors would say, "He has something different. I don't know what to call it, but it's there." One evening, when Gere auditioned for an off-Broadway play, the director looked at him and said, "You seem too gentle. I need someone stronger." That sentence devastated Richard for days. A friend recalled that he lay on the floor without speaking, staring at the ceiling as if wondering whether the silence inside him was a flaw no one wanted to accept. It was during this period that he began learning meditation, at first only to control his breath before going on stage, but later becoming a lifelong spiritual anchor. However, the challenges didn't stop there. Many theaters rejected him not because he lacked skill, but because he was too handsome. One director even said bluntly, "You look more like a model than a serious stage actor." Gere was never proud of his looks. In fact, he saw them as an obstacle that prevented others from seeing the deepest part of his soul. The part he had been trying to discover since the days he held that trumpet in the small Syracuse home. But then the first rays of light began to appear. In 1973, Gere auditioned for Danny Zuko in the official Broadway production of Grease. He reached the final round and was rejected. The reason sounded strange. He was too deep, too artistic, not cocky enough. But fate unfolds in its own way. A few months later, Gere was chosen for the national touring production of Grease and became the audience's favorite member of the cast. One critic wrote, "Richard Gere gives Danny a heart, not just swagger." It was the first time people realized that his quietness was a strength, not a weakness. Even so, that attention did not bring an easy life. Gere was still a young actor living in a harsh city where every day someone new arrived with more hunger and less fear. And in all that noise, Gere maintained his distance. Not out of arrogance, but because he still hadn't found where he truly belonged. He always felt he was beside the light, but not fully in the light. In the late 70s, a major opportunity came from an unexpected place, London. Gere went to the UK for stage work and happened to meet director Terrence Malick in a cafe. They talked for nearly an hour without mentioning casting. At the end, Malick simply said, "I need your kind of silence." And with that, Gere was cast in Days of Heaven, 1978. It wasn't a box office explosion, but it was the film that first made Hollywood pay attention to him. Looking back, Gere often described the years 1968-1979 as the period when he was learning to be an adult in a world too loud. But it was this series of experiences, being told he was too soft, selling the trumpet, performing a show that made an entire theater rise to its feet. That conversation with Malick, that built the foundation for the man he would soon become. And it was in this same period that Gere discovered the most important truth about acting. It is not about transformation, but confrontation. Confronting the character, society, and especially oneself. That was what made Gere different. He did not try to stand out. He tried to be true. One director once said, He can stand completely still and be more compelling than an entire moving room. Others called it a silence with weight. Gere understood this, but did not take pride in it. For him, silence was merely a temporary refuge where he could listen to what was happening inside. Things planted long ago by a quiet childhood. By the end of 1979, Richard Gere had reached age 30. A 30 without success, without wealth, without anything remarkable to boast about. But it was precisely those wandering years that created the foundation he would need when Hollywood's spotlight suddenly poured over him in the early 80s. Without this period, he would have been just another handsome actor. But because of it, he became an artist carrying both light and shadow, something that allowed him to create roles no one else could. And then the opportunity came. A role no one thought would change the course of his life. A role that would transform Richard Gere from a nobody into an irreplaceable face. But before that light could burst forth, life had already taught him everything he needed to know about patience, loneliness, and silence. Those challenging years were the provisions for a lifetime of artistry, and the opening chapter to a brilliant, yet deeply conflicted era waiting just ahead. Stepping into the 1980s, Richard Gere had gone through nearly 10 years of uncertainty. Small roles, nights performing to half-empty theaters, months when he had to sell his childhood trumpet to pay rent, stage performances that gave him existence, but not an escape. It was the period when Gere stood on the boundary between good enough and not chosen. And then, a chance meeting, an unexpected withdrawal, and an uncanny intuition led him to the role that would change the entire rest of his life. In 1979, director Paul Schrader wrote American Gigolo. Schrader wanted to find a face that could evoke fragility without weakness, sensuality without vulgarity, coldness that still carried pain. He tested many actors and initially chose John Travolta. Travolta had nearly signed, but at the last minute pulled out because he feared the nude scenes, a seemingly small detail that redirected Gere's fate. While the studios scrambled to find a replacement, a production assistant mentioned Richard Gere. Schrader watched Days of Heaven and was haunted by that gaze. Calm, heavy, yet drifting toward a place beyond the frame. Schrader immediately called Gere. The two sat together for less than an hour. Gere didn't ask about money or shooting schedules. He only asked, "How do you want Julian to be sexy? Sexy because he is loved, or sexy because he is empty?" And Schrader replied, "Empty." Just one word. Gere understood instantly. In 1980, American Gigolo premiered, a film that seemed born at precisely the moment Gere was ready for the world to see the soft darkness of a man. The loneliness, the confinement, the fragile line between sexuality, power, and emptiness. Julian Kay was not a hero, not the strong archetype Hollywood was used to. He was a man who knew fear, and strangely, Gere portrayed fear with an unusual stillness. Not too many words, not too many gestures. Only a gaze containing the emptiness he had spent a lifetime trying to hide. One of the film's most famous scenes, Julian standing before his wardrobe, changing suits as if conversing with himself, was Gere's own idea. He said, "Lonely people don't talk much. They choose clothes the way they choose a mask." That scene became iconic, not only for its style, but because the emptiness beneath that polished surface was the same emptiness Gere carried during his anonymous years. Then came the fateful handshake with Giorgio Armani. Schrader wanted Julian to look as if he stepped out of a cold, luxurious world. so he asked Armani to design the wardrobe. Gere only needed to slip on the jacket for the character to settle into his shoulders. After the film, Armani suit sales rose by 400%, making Gere inadvertently the face who transformed men's fashion in the 1980s, something he never considered an achievement. Though its impact was undeniable, the film turned Richard Gere into the emblem of a kind of sensuality that was quiet, unshowy, sensuality born from sadness. But that rapid rise to fame was a double-edged sword. Gere became a magazine favorite, the man the media called the new masculine ideal of the 80s, yet he was never fully comfortable with the title. Not because he dismissed it, but because he knew he wasn't born to be an icon. He was born to tell the truth of human stories. 2 years later, in 1982, Gere took on the role of Zach Mayo in An Officer and a Gentleman. The film seemed like a familiar setup, the strong young officer, the factory girl, but the truth was far more complex. Tension behind the scenes, especially between Gere and Deborah Winger, accidentally created a chemistry that was electric on screen. They barely spoke off camera, were not close, and Winger even said, "I couldn't stand him outside the set." That distance made their scenes together brutally authentic. The director said, "I reset the camera 3 times. Every time Richard entered the frame, everything became more cinematic." The final scene, Zach carrying Paula through the factory as workers applaud, almost had a different ending. Winger wanted it darker. Gere was the one who convinced the director to keep the original. "The audience needs a moment of light," he said. And that moment became one of the decade's most iconic images. Hollywood loves heroes. Audiences love happy endings. But Gere wasn't the kind of man who wanted to mold himself into that archetype. He played Zach Mayo so convincingly that the world viewed him as strong, decisive, sincere. While deep inside, he was still the same Syracuse boy. Sensitive, quiet, always carrying the fear of never being enough. Thus, the 1980s were both radiant and fractured. Gere once admitted, "I was seen by everyone, but no one saw who I really was." That wasn't the statement of an arrogant star. It was the confession of someone who didn't know where to place himself amid the light shining down on him. Fame came with everything he hated most: rumors, speculation, the suffocation of the press. There were days he stepped outside only to find silence, something that barely existed anymore. There were nights he looked back on his journey and wondered, "Is this really what I want?" A million people saw him smile, but hardly anyone knew that deep inside, there was always a dim space he could never fill. It was precisely these fractures that led him to Buddhism and meditation, not to escape Hollywood, but to escape the chaos within. Meditation for him was not a religion, but a way to preserve the human part of himself that fame was slowly swallowing. He learned to release expectations, release praise and criticism, release even the idea that he had to maintain the image of a masculine icon. But letting go was not easy in an era when Hollywood always demanded more from the people it chose to spotlight. Toward the decade's end, things seemed to quiet slightly. And then 1990 arrived, bringing one of the biggest moments of Gere's career: Pretty Woman. The role of Edward Lewis, the wealthy, calm, refined man, felt as though he stepped right out of the very essence Gere had been protecting for years. A quiet kindness, a loneliness hard to name, and a heart never fully belonging to where it stood. He initially refused, Richard Gere didn't want to do a romantic comedy. He said the script was too simple and the character had no soul. Julia Roberts flew in, handed him a small note saying, "Please say yes." And with just that look, Gere understood that the film needed something he could give: gentleness, kindness, the beautiful loneliness of a man who doesn't know how to love, but longs to be loved. Julia Roberts and Richard Gere became one of the most iconic romantic pairs in American cinema. Audiences loved them not just for the modern fairy tale, but for the softness, the slowness, and the silences between the characters. Silences Gere performed not through technique, but through the years he spent struggling to be heard. Pretty Woman made Gere America's gentleman. But that title opened another path, the path of new complications. Fame on a global scale magnified every movement he made. Preconceptions, rumors, expectations, all began to close in, as if Hollywood wanted to mold him into the image they desired. What no one knew then was this: Pretty Woman, the most beautiful film of Gere's career, would also become the stepping stone to the harshest upheavals of his life. Upheavals not born from failure, but from his willingness to speak truths Hollywood did not want to hear. But that is the story of the years that came later. For now, in the radiant 1980s, Richard Gere appeared like a brilliant star suddenly streaking across a sky full of giants. Yet even while standing in the light, he remained a man carrying a very small loneliness inside, a loneliness he never truly escaped. In the early 1990s, when Richard Gere was standing at the peak of his career, he had no idea he was stepping into the darkest period of his life. The peak is always the most dangerous place. From there, with just one misstep, a person can fall before they even have time to cling to anything. For Gere, that fall did not come from a mistake he made, but from the cruelty of rumors, the cold judgment of Hollywood, and the loneliness that even the most famous cannot escape. Around 1995, Gere became the target of a malicious rumor. A rumor entirely fabricated, baseless, and so toxic that anyone could have been shaken by its spread. It wasn't just a scandal. It was a deep wound, a sharp blade that the media unintentionally or deliberately stabbed into a man who never wanted to expose his private life. Gere's team wanted to sue. His friends wanted him to speak up, but he chose silence. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew any denial would only keep the story alive longer. He said, "If I react, it means I accept playing in the mud they threw me into." And so he withdrew. Friends recalled that during those years, Gere often lost sleep, avoided reading newspapers, and carried an invisible fear that others would look at him differently. Not because the rumor was true, but because people tend to believe the ugly over the kind. During that period, Gere married Cindy Crawford, 1991-1995, a world-famous supermodel and a Hollywood movie star. The couple looked as though they were born to stand beside each other. But behind the glamorous image was a marriage between two people who never truly got the chance to live together. A 17-year age gap, packed schedules, flights across continents, and the fame of both became an invisible wall that pushed them farther apart each day. Cindy once said a sentence that haunted Gere for years. "We loved each other, but we didn't really live together." When she said that, Gere realized a painful truth. Sometimes love is not insufficient. It is simply too fragile to withstand the weight of the spotlight. During these years, even as he was a global star after Pretty Woman, Gere lived through the loneliest period of his life. The loneliness didn't come from the absence of someone beside him, but from the fact that no one saw what he was fighting inside. Then, in 1993, Richard Gere walked onto the Oscar stage. At the time, he was only invited to present an award. But he did something no American star had ever dared to do in front of hundreds of millions of live viewers. He spoke out about human rights, spoke out for Tibet, and criticized China's repression. It wasn't a prepared speech. It was something he had carried in his heart for too long, a truth he no longer wanted to bury. But Hollywood, where power, commerce, and politics are always intertwined, never forgives anyone for breaking their script. After he finished speaking, the entire auditorium fell silent. But the greater silence came afterward. Hollywood slowly closed its doors to him. A powerful producer pulled him backstage and said bluntly, "Richard, this is not the place for you to tell the truth." Gere replied softly, "I'm not talking politics. I'm talking about people." The man smiled. "And that's exactly why you will pay for it." The prophecy came true word for word. Starting the following year, the Oscars never invited him back. No awards, no presenting, no honorary attendance for nearly 20 years. Major studios began avoiding him. Big projects disappeared without explanation. A director who had once been close to him called at midnight to apologize because he had been forced to replace the lead actor. Gere only said, "I understand. Don't worry about me." Then he sat alone in his dressing room, not angry, just feeling as though a great door had closed. And as if his personal life was pulled into the same vortex, Gere and Cindy Crawford's marriage ended in 1995. It was a relationship admired by many, yet it closed with disappointment for both. Gere walked away from that marriage not as a defeated man, but as someone who understood that sometimes you cannot protect both your heart and your fame at the same time. A decade later, Gere called Cindy to apologize. Not to reconcile, but to acknowledge that in his youth he had been too consumed by work to be the husband she needed. Cindy said his voice was very soft and very sad. It was a conversation that closed a chapter they had tried to keep beautiful with kindness, even when they could not keep it with happiness. From 1995 to the mid-2000s, Gere's career entered an unprecedentedly quiet phase. Not because he had lost his talent, but because Hollywood had chosen to step back from him. Leading roles in major films vanished. The press began calling him a washed-up star, as if a few lines of print could erase a lifetime of dedication. But Gere didn't object, didn't explain, didn't try to prove he still shone. He simply said one sentence that later became his life philosophy. "I'm not afraid of losing fame. I'm afraid of losing myself." During this time, Gere disappeared from Hollywood for several weeks. He drove alone from New York to California, crossing thousands of miles without telling anyone. A friend said, "In those days, Richard needed to know whether he was still free, or had become a product of an industry that only knows how to take." But even as his spirit grew tired, his body also began to pay the price. During a chase scene, Gere slipped in the wrong direction and suffered a severe neck injury. It seemed minor at first, but later forced him to limit many physically demanding roles. The accident didn't kill his career, but it made him realize a truth artists usually understand only halfway through life. The body has limits, and time favors no one. Looking back at 1991-2006, people often say it was the darkest period of Gere's life. But to him, it was the most important. It was the toxic rumors, the fragile marriage, the shocking Oscar speech, Hollywood's angry silence, the roles taken away, and even the injury that forced him to slow down. All merging into a period of purification, a painful but necessary phase for Gere to reclaim the core he had lost. For years, Gere walked through Hollywood like a traveler crossing a desert. Few footprints, little noise, but steady in his own direction. He gradually understood that truth had cost him many things: fame, opportunities, roles, light. But at least truth preserved what mattered most: inner peace. And only those who have lost peace know how precious it truly is. After more than a decade walking through the darkest stretch of his life, Richard Gere entered midlife not with noise or a new explosion, but with a quieter, slower, deeper breath. It was a period of healing, from old wounds, from things he had once lost, and from the soft corners of himself that Hollywood had never truly seen. He met Carey Lowell, former model, actress, a woman with a calmness he sensed immediately. Unlike the youthful romances overshadowed by schedules and pressure, Carey came to Gere at a time when he had enough experience to know what to hold on to and what to let go of. The two married in 2002, but it wasn't until after the harshest upheavals of his life that the relationship truly became a place where he could find peaceful breathing again. It was Carey who first told Gere that he deserved a family, something he had doubted about himself for many years. "Your gentleness is part of a future family," Carey said. And perhaps it was that very sentence that made Gere, who had always feared he wasn't built for fatherhood, suddenly believe he could become a better man. In 2000, when Carey became pregnant, Gere was filming in Europe. News that Carey had gone into early labor made him immediately abandon his entire schedule and board the first flight to New York. A crew member recalled, "Richard kept repeating, 'I need to be there, even if it's just 5 minutes early.' And he made it." Gere called that moment the moment I knew my life needed to slow down. From then on, gentleness became the center of how he lived. During their years together at the Pound Ridge farm, the two maintained a beautiful ritual. Each morning, before speaking a single word, they meditated side by side for 20-30 minutes. No guidance, no philosophy. Just quiet presence. Like two streams standing next to each other without merging, but flowing in the same direction. Carey said, "That was when we were closest. Not when we talked, but when we didn't need to say anything." But love didn't just heal his private life. It brought Gere back to art in a way he didn't expect. In 2002, Chicago premiered, a film sparkling like Broadway. But for Gere, it was a rebirth. Chicago gave him the chance to return not as the romantic icon of the 80s-90s, but as a versatile, refined, effortlessly charming artist. And amusingly, Gere performed most of his own choreography in the film, something not many people know. He joked, "I didn't think I could spin like that at my age." The role of Billy Flynn earned him a Golden Globe, but what he valued most wasn't the award, but the lesson. "I realized I could still tell beautiful stories as long as I was honest." That sentence was also how he looked back on his journey through crisis. He no longer tried to be the figure Hollywood wanted him to be. He only wanted to be the truest version of himself. In the following years, Gere rebuilt his career with independent films, places where no one cared whether he was blacklisted by Hollywood or not. And then, the greatest turning point of this resurgence came from a small independent film. Arbitrage, 2012. Hollywood may have turned its back on him, but art did not. In this film, Gere played Robert Miller, a successful businessman, cold, full of secrets, and full of moral fractures he himself did not dare confront. The role wasn't built from light, but from darkness. Darkness Gere understood better than anyone after years of being pushed to the margins of the very industry that once exalted him. Many critics said that Arbitrage was Gere's best performance in 20 years. But to Gere himself, that role felt like a mirror. It reflected a part of his essence, not the sensuality of American Gigolo, not the gentleman of Pretty Woman, but the contemplative nature of a man who had passed through fracture, loss, silence, and finally found strength in the very things that once seemed like weaknesses. Director Nicholas Gere once said he feared Gere would reject the role of Miller, because this was a role that demanded opening your heart down to the bone, something not every seasoned actor is willing to do in the later years of life. But Gere simply said, "I know this man. I've been him, in another way." And that was when Gere understood Gere didn't need to act. He only needed to remember. And so, through that honesty, his performance in Arbitrage brought Gere back into the artistic current. Not as the dazzling star of the 1980s, 1990s, but as a man rich in experience, mature and quiet. A kind of light that time cannot extinguish. However, this journey of rebirth was not without its fractures. His marriage with Carrie Lowell gradually wore down after 2012, when both began moving in different emotional directions. Carrie needed stability. Gere needed stillness, sometimes too much for a relationship that required sharing. They separated in 2015 without noise or bitterness. Just two people who once loved each other learning to part with kindness. Carrie remains someone Gere always speaks of with gratitude, and that alone shows how deeply he valued this chapter. From 2007 to 2016, Gere did not try to return to Hollywood as he had in his youth. He didn't seek to surpass younger actors, didn't fight for big projects, didn't strive to prove he was still a star. What he did was different. He chose truthful stories, small but profound films, characters that forced him to look inward. And through that, Richard Gere returned, not as a box office icon, but as a man seasoned, refined, and psychologically deep. Gere once said at the end of 2016, "It took me years to understand that the light isn't where people cheer for you. It's where your mind is no longer chaotic." There are phases in life that don't lift you higher, but bring you back to exactly where you need to stand. For Gere, 2007 and 2016 was that phase. After the storms, after years of paying the price for truth, after unnamed losses, he found the most important thing: a peaceful soul, steady enough to continue telling beautiful stories. Entering his 70s, Richard Gere no longer walked as quickly as before, but each step became steadier, lighter, and filled with an awareness of time's finiteness. This was not a chapter of glory, nor of giant posters outside theaters, nor of a loud comeback like many of his contemporaries. This was a chapter of quiet, of reflections, of things a person only understands after having survived enough storms. In 2017, Gere met Alejandra Silva, a woman who came to him not for golden statues, not for legendary Hollywood fame, but for the gentleness and stillness he had spent years cultivating. She was more than 3 decades younger, yet the gap did not create distance. It seemed to fill the years in which Gere had been searching for a kind of nameless peace. When asked what brought them together, Alejandra simply said, "He is someone who sees with his heart before he sees with his eyes." That was also the answer to this entire stage of his life, a period in which Gere lived less with Hollywood and more with his own life. He devoted more time to humanitarian work, to Tibet, to impoverished communities he had visited since his youth. No more constant flights, no more studio meetings, no more worries about box office numbers. Gere lived as though each day was a conscious choice between what mattered and what did not. A close friend said that from 2018 onward, Gere walked like a man who had finally found the direction toward home. He no longer wanted heavy roles, nor did he seek major projects. What he cared about was whether the story he told said something about humanity, about sadness, kindness, loneliness, or hope. His role in Three Christs, 2017, did not create wide buzz, but it was one of the projects he accepted because there was something deeply human in it. It was a choice Gere made not for fame, but for feeling. These years were also when Gere faced aging more deeply, something he welcomed not with fear, but with the peace of someone who had already survived what both light and darkness had placed in his path. He said, "Age doesn't take anything from me. It only removes the things I don't need." Carrie Lowell and Gere no longer walked the same path, but the respect remained. His son, Homer, was now a grown young man, and Gere was proud that this was the most right thing he had ever done. And Alejandra, with her gentle heart and unexpected harmony, helped him enter his 70s, not feeling as though he was closing, but simply quieting. And it was in this quiet that Gere began thinking about legacy, not the legacy of a star, but of a human being. What he leaves behind is not merely films, not just Julian or Edward Lewis, not only cinematic legends. What he leaves behind lies in how he chose to live, choosing truth over safety, human rights over power, stillness over noise, small roles with soul over large roles that said nothing about life. A journalist once asked him what he wished audiences would remember about him. Gere smiled gently, as if the question no longer mattered, and said, "If they remember me as someone who lived kindly, that's enough." The final years of the 2010s and the early 2020s were not the brightest chapter, but they were the truest chapter of Richard Gere. He learned to let go of the things that once frightened him, learned to love with a wider heart, learned to see life as a flowing river that must be allowed to pass without being held. And in that flow, the man who once faced cruelty, loneliness, and abandonment finally found something the brightest years of his life had never brought him: enduring peace. And that peace is the most beautiful part of his legacy. There are lives that are not remembered by the number of awards earned or the films that broke box office records. They are remembered through silences, the moments when a person stands before their own choices and decides not to betray who they truly are. Richard Gere is one of those lives. Across nearly half a century of work, he walked through both sides of the light, the radiant side that lifted him into icon status, and the blinding side that nearly burned him. He was once sought after by every magazine cover, then quietly abandoned by Hollywood. Once celebrated as America's gentleman, then reduced to someone studios hesitated to even mention because of a single sentence that dared to touch the truth. Once adored by the whole world, then reduced to driving alone across America for days just to find his breath again. Yet it was in those seemingly lost moments that Gere found what early glory could never give: a peace no spotlight can buy, a freedom born from accepting that he no longer needed to stand at the center of the world. Looking back, Gere's greatest legacy is not the films that made him a legend, nor the drifting sensuality of the 1980s, nor the haunting sadness in his eyes that cameras long to capture. His greatest legacy is the way he chose to live. He chose truth over safety, compassion over power, meditation over noise, roles with soul over big roles that said nothing about humanity. And in the end, he chose something rare in a world full of pushing and pulling: kindness. Years ago, when asked what he wanted audiences to remember about him, Gere simply smiled and said softly, "If they remember me as someone who lived kindly, that's enough." That sentence, more than any film, more than any scandal, more than any spotlight, is the map guiding us through his entire life. A life that gave up glory to keep authenticity. A life that understood light is not found where we are applauded, but where we no longer fear the dark. And when the final light fades on the stage of a long life, what remains is not noise, but stillness. The kind of stillness only those who have walked through many storms can carry in their hearts. If Richard Gere's journey reminds you of those who chose truth even when it cost them, those who lived slowly to preserve the purest part of themselves, leave a small sign under the video, not for counting, but so we know that stories like this are still being heard. Thank you for staying until the end, in the most beautiful stillness of this story. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more cinematic journeys into the lives behind the fame. This is Hollywood Biographies, the light, the silence, the legacy.